Hello and welcome to Ordinary, a podcast that aims to help Christians live for Christ in everyday life. My name is Josh Bannister, and each week I sit down with a couple of UK pastors, Graham Nichols and Mark Whettam. If you remember the days of ordinary apologetics, then you're a real one. Today on the podcast, we're dealing with some quick fire questions related to some of those areas that we looked at in depth in the past. More often than not, we're not faced with a great deal of time to break down somebody's question about God or Christianity. So today we think through some of the shorter answers we could give that might answer the question or help to continue the conversation. Enjoy the episode.
My name is G-Dog.
I want to something cool, and I'm M-Cat.
Oh no.
Come on, Josh. You got to go with Sonic, man.
Josh is just
I couldn't
Josh.
be M-Dog.
J-Fish?
J-Fish.
Hey, J-Fish.
Maybe?
J-Fish, M-Cat, and G-Dog.
Okay.
There we go. There's some random new names that's going to come back and bite us, I'm sure.
What are we listening to?
We're listening to Ordinary.
And boy, is it.
They're listening to Ordinary. We're actually just listening to ourselves being banal.
Ordinary.
Very ordinary.
It's true. If anybody calls me J-Fish, I'll be...
We'll be blessed, particularly if they're from another country.
It's going to be my new Instagram handle.
Exactly. When you get a phone call from, China, an email, hey, J-Fish, yeah, you've made it. Cause
China have actually stopped calling me. I don't know why. I must have offended them. Guys, great podcast today. We're going to do some quick fire apologetic-y type questions. We've done Ordinary Apologetics as a sort of series in, back in season 2 and 3-ish. Maybe we even started it in 1 actually, where we did a bunch of deep dives, whole podcast on one apologetic argument or on one difficult question. And those are all still there in the archive if you want to head back to those and get more depth on a particular question. But today we thought it would be useful to just do some quick fire questions, just to give you an idea of something you might be able to say, at least in by way of answering, just starting to answer a question, or by way of continuing a conversation with somebody. So not looking to sort of knock them out of the park or win with some sort of hands down logical argument, but just something you could respond to somebody's comment with, which is probably more often than not what we're dealing with as Christians. It's probably quite rare that you get an hour to sit down with somebody and have the deep apologetic time with them, which is great if you can get there. But more realistic perhaps is the the school gate, the over the drink question that you might need to
walking the dog,
yeah,
in the
not
barber.
The G-Dog. I mean, you could walk the G-Dog, but that would be an interesting experience. There you go.
Walking with G-Dog, a new podcast series.
G-Dog.
So that's what we're going to do.
Dogs.
Yeah, G-Dog and his dogs.
G-Dog and the dogs. Feels like life on the farm.
Before we get cracking with some of those questions, though, worth having a little upfront discussion about how we answer questions and considering where people are coming from when they ask their questions. So, Graham, kick us off with some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think when we get into discussion with people, it's always worth trying to figure out, where did that come from? How did I suddenly get into this? And obviously, you don't always have time to analyse, but just to kind of a quick think and maybe a quick prayer to say, are they asking because they're really hurting about something? It's something personal to do with them. They have an experience, they have a relative, they're struggling with something themselves, which is really making them anxious or angry with God or something. So that might condition how we ask it. Or it might be they just heard once some knockout question that would sort of knock Christians out of the park. And that's quite different. Or they might be genuinely interested, but they actually don't want a long answer. They kind of would just like to know that there is an answer out there. So we can't be experts on it, but I think just trying to figure out where the question is coming from. But then, however we figure that out, is kind of move on with gentleness, which maybe Mark might want to pick up on.
Well, I was just thinking, as you said that, one of the ways in which we can discover that is just by asking. Just acknowledging that's a great question. What made you think it? What made you ask it? And it's kind of a natural response, but it gives them a chance to begin to unpick what they're thinking and where they're at, which may just also has the added advantage of just giving you time to think about how you're going to answer it. But it also just shows concern and love, genuinely. We're not just kind of assuming this is kind of just a intellectual exercise. It may lead to a very different answer. It may lead to a much more pastoral or a care or who knows. But I think just asking that question. And then I think that the whole time, we were thinking about this on Sunday in our service, how Jesus doesn't break a bruised reed or snuff out a smouldering wick. Just that sense of gentleness, patience with folks, not thinking you have to kind of win the argument. Actually, because I think sometimes we feel, we're on the defensive, we've got to fight back, and actually we don't. We're confident that the Lord is the Lord, and He's at work. And all we need to do is be thoughtful, kind, patient, gentle, compassionate.
Because I don't think we're doing the suffering one so much today, but sometimes when people ask you about suffering, they are asking because they have an illness, a close relative has an illness, they've experienced a tragedy in their life. So again, like Mark was saying, it might be worth asking, why did you ask that question? And that might uncover that. And probably that's not the moment to unleash a whole kind of logical argument to do with suffering. It may just be a moment to just express compassion and talk about the compassion of Jesus at the grave of Lazarus, for example, or weeping over Jerusalem, that Jesus does have compassion for the consequences of being in a broken world. And that may be all you want to say, like God cares, 2 words. Just to give a concrete example of thinking about what's behind the question sort of thing.
Yeah, good. Biblical mandate for being prepared to give an answer. Do you want to talk about that for a second? Do you think it's something that we ought to be ready for? Something that Christians ought to actually consciously prep themselves for?
Great question, Josh. Tell me why do you want that?
So in the New
Testament,
Testament,
a coaching session.
Tell me more.
It's in the New Testament somewhere.
There's this book called the Bible, and in it there's a book called 1 Peter, and in that there's a chapter called 3 and a verse called 15, and it talks about being ready to give an answer for the hope that's within you. So I wonder if that's got any relevance.
I think it has in terms of being prepared, as you well know. It's sometimes used as an apologetic for apologetics, isn't it? Did you see what I did there?
I did.
But that it justifies apologetics, which I think it does. But in the context, when it goes on to say about do it with gentleness and respect, it's about talking about our hope rather than our logic. So it just reminded me to say that it's very effective in answering questions to also personalize them. So to say, well, here's a little bit of a snippet of an answer, but also, this is how I've had to wrestle with this question, or this is my hope in this situation, which is, personal. The answer to every question isn't, this is what I think, and it's all personal, but it is worth trying to connect it with their own personal experience somehow. When I talk about people suffering, assisted dying, for example, when I was answering some questions on the radio, it wasn't a bad thing to mention, my own mother who's quite ill, well, sort of decaying at the moment, as it were. That's probably not a nice word for my mother, but you know what I mean, getting worse and worse. And I think it was legitimate to sort of bring that in and say, I've had to wrestle with those sort of questions of seeing someone who's getting iller and iller kind of in front of you. And I think it has a narrative power to it when you're saying, I'm wrestling with that question, but coming to the conclusion that I shouldn't assist her to die, as it were, which is, so you're giving the sort of the logic, but you're also giving the personal. Does that resonate at all? I think to be fair, Mark, you talked about that when we were doing the one on assisted dying, didn't you? You talked about your own mother and sort of thoughts about dignity and so forth. And I think that was legitimate to bring that in because it's the hope that you have.
Yeah, and I think that is what we're trying to do, isn't it? At the end of the day, Christianity is all about a God who is personal.
Yeah.
So we want to be personal in about expressing the hope and how that works out. Because actually, more often than not, behind the question is, does Christianity work?
Yeah.
How's it working in your life? What does that look? What does it look like? How you squaring? How are you making sense of the world? I mean, that people who are genuinely inquiring are kind of, that's what they want to know. They want to know how this makes sense of the world they're seeing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How does this connect? How are you making sense of it? How's this working out for you in your life?
Well, let me move us on to some questions then, and the first one is probably one of the most hot potato ones, or one of the easiest ones that can get shot at Christians out of a gun, what feels like a gun sometimes, which is the question of homosexuality. So it might be phrased something like, why does God hate gay people? Or don't Christians hate gay people? Something like that. How do you deal with a question along the lines of that, or an accusation along those lines?
Do you want to start, Mark?
Well, I mean, I think on that one particularly, you want to ask the question of why. I think, why are you asking this? The great question. People often think that, but why are you asking it? And then I think we want to explore that. Because I think, although we haven't said it, actually, one of the ways of really answering difficult questions is by asking questions back, to understand where they're coming from, to understand, because actually we're moving towards. But I think also just trying to understand, where they got that from. Is that something you've read? Is that something you've heard? Is that something you've, misunderstood? Because, you get to the point anywhere, well, that's not the Bible I read, in that sense of what, hated looks. And I think in this culture as well, you want to find out whether people are, are they trying to set you up? They're you're catching all this in lots of, is this said in the canteen with everyone else listening? Or is this said on a one-to-one, just trying to work it out? I think you have to suss out where that is, because you're going to answer it differently. If it's in a pastoral, personal situation, I'd want to know why that is, and then I'd want to start taking them to the Bible, showing actually God's good purposes for relationships, but actually why He, in that sense, does His great love for humanity seen in the cross, but His very clear boundaries and guidelines that help us and seek us, of which homosexuality falls outside of His boundaries, as does any sexual relationship outside of that of marriage. God isn't biased in that way. He's set the boundaries. He knows what He's doing, and express something of that love.
And I think it's really good to say that, if you can, just get people to do a quick logical flow to say, if God is the supreme ruler and creator, and He knows what is good, what He says is good must be good. So however uncomfortable it feels, what we're saying about sexual ethics is good if God exists and God is the authority. Of course, if God doesn't exist, then we can't really debate it, because it's just your opinion against mine. But I think just get people to think, okay, in theory, just allow for a moment that God exists and that He's good. If He said something is good and something is not good, then we have to trust Him on it. And so the most loving thing to do is to not do the bad and do the good, or not condone the bad and encourage the good. And so we're being the most loving, and God is being the most loving when He's telling us the good things to do. So probably that sounded a bit convoluted, but I think in your own words, something about it's good because God says it's good. It's good to have the privilege of sex within marriage. And it's not about sometimes people say, it doesn't matter who you love. And we would say, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter who you love. The question is taking God's very specific gift of sex and importing that into other relationships outside of marriage. That's the issue. So it's not really about love or not love. It's not about acceptance, not acceptance. It is basically about that physical relationship with someone outside marriage. But I think there's related questions that are worth, or related points throwing in there, saying that there are people who are attracted to people of the same sex in lots of churches, including ours. If you came to our church, would you be welcome? Absolutely. If you came with your gay partner, would you be welcome? Absolutely. We'd speak the truth to you, but we'd love you, and we're not obsessed with talking about that particular topic. So I think it's worth throwing those things in as well.
Yeah, I like that last point very much. And don't you think in a way it's kind of nice and jarring to respond to that kind of question with no? If someone says something like that to me, doesn't God hate gay people? My immediate response would be no, not at all. Why on earth would you think that? Because He doesn't, does He? God doesn't hate people. God loves people. And trying to differentiate the person from the things that the person does, and then try to help somebody understand what the concept of sin is, because God hates my sin.
A good corollary. a good corollary to that. I just remembered now that I was asked once on a radio interview, what if your daughter told you she was gay? What would you do? And I said, love her, like I did before.
Exactly.
And it was like, yeah, but you'd say it was wrong, wouldn't you? And I'd say, yeah, but I'd love her. So, and that was quite disarming. But now you've mentioned that, Josh, I'm thinking I could have just gone immediately to say, and that's just like God. But I didn't at the time, but now I can.
Yeah. Well, there you go, G-Dog.
But it's interesting, just actually what that question flags as well is the different responses. Is that one is you can be very apologetic. You're trying to unpick the kind of wrong understanding of God and view. Another is also coming in from a very pastoral kind of position of you're welcome to the church. You're accepted. We would love you. And then there's the other side. And I think that's where asking the question helps you to kind of then clarify where your answer is.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be your starting point will be different. You're going to start if someone is expressing, well, I'm same-sex attracted. Then you're going to really affirm love, welcome, acceptance, and move towards the kind of who God is God's goodness, the boundaries. If it's purely if it's a kind of, well, I'm just wrestling with who God is and how God can fit in this world, then you're going to start with a much more apologetic-based answer about where God is and who he is. So it just underlines the importance of understanding where people are coming from.
Agreed. Isn't God intolerant?
No. Yes.
In a way, yes, and in a way, not quite. Good answer, Mark. We'll move on to the next question.
Thank you.
I think that it is connected sometimes with that, but also I think with sort of intolerant of everything, kind of wrongdoing, personal choices we make, other religions, sin in general. And I think again, it's fair to say, just allow for a moment that God exists, then it's reasonable for him to say what is good and what is bad, and it's reasonable for him to make the rules. And it's very reassuring that he doesn't like and he doesn't condone and he will judge things that are evil. Because ultimately we all feel pretty happy that bad stuff gets judged. And the only bit that we're struggling over is whether God has the right to be the judge. But we all like the idea that bad people get punished and good people get rewarded. We just like to be the ones who decide, and that the only thing we've got to do is let God do that. And then tolerance and intolerance is yeah. Well, that's only one stream of answers. Probably different streams of answering that to do with other topics.
Well, I think it's just, in that sense, isn't it? God is very clear in terms of what he's not like us. It's kind of things are a bit fuzzy. There's a very clear defined. This is right. This is wrong.
Yeah.
That was how it is. It's our rebellion and our rejection that's kind of made all that upside down and fuzzy and grey that then feels like he's been intolerant. Whereas actually God just says, well, no, this is right and this is wrong. He's clear in that way. But interestingly, when the Bible then describes his character, actually, what do we read in terms of Exodus 34?
Yeah.
He's the compassionate, gracious God. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in love and faithfulness. He maintains love. He forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. So his character is moving towards us in love, in patience. So in one sense, that doesn't sound like a intolerant God who is harsh and cruel, but he is clear and he doesn't tolerate sin. But at the same time, he's a God of such mercy and abounding in love and compassion and grace that he moves towards us to the degree that he sent his son Jesus. So what kind of God do you want? You want a God who is really clear and holy and just and above us, and yet is so filled with compassion and love. And I think sometimes we focus so much on the judgment, harshness, as it were, or the wrath of God, and we forget that actually the overwhelming characteristic of the Bible presents him as is compassionate, abounding in love, gracious, compassionate, and emphasises far more that side, even though he absolutely is holy and clear in boundaries.
Yeah. Just to throw one in, as well.
Graham's looking like,
if it's a
I
no,
can't work out what Graham's face is. It's like,
I'm listening with great interest, but trying to remember the one little thing I was going to say while listening to you at the same time. It's very hard for me to think and listen at the same time. So the one thing I was going to say was, sometimes if it's a knockabout discussion, you can throw things in like, so do you think we're a tolerant society? And people say, oh yeah, we're very tolerant these days. And you say, well, if I said Jesus was the only way to God, Jesus tells us about sexual ethics, Jesus tells us about gender, Jesus tells us about religion. Would you tolerate that view? Would you tolerate me telling people? And people say, no, I wouldn't tolerate that. And you say, so intolerance is kind of all right as long as we set the rules for what's tolerated. So it's the kind of myth, but it is a buzzword, which is why it gets sort of bandied around.
Just hilariously, this was supposed to be a quick fire. Nothing we ever do is quick fire, is it? No, as soon as Graham and I get going, it's never quick fire, is it?
Okay. I'll try and be briefer.
Well, not just you, bro. I mean, I think G-Dog
we're doing order
cat,
now. We're bro. We're G-Dog.
I wonder about also
Buddy. We're gonna get Buddy in there as well. All right, Buddy.
That quick one on tolerance, like. Don't you think that tolerance has been misunderstood in the sense that people don't really understand what they mean when they say tolerance, right? So they think that essentially people are only tolerant with things they agree with, which is to completely misunderstand what the meaning of tolerance is. To tolerate is to allow something that you don't agree with, that you vehemently disagree with, and still die for the right of that person to hold that view, even though you disagree with it. Whereas I think we've become a society that thinks that only tolerates what it agrees with, which is completely pointless.
Which is ultimately the gospel, isn't it? Christ comes and dies for those who were his enemies. He died whilst we were his enemies, not whilst we were his friends, whilst we were opposed to him.
Yeah. I think on that point as well, Josh, I think it's a little bit broader than we only tolerate things we agree with. I think we tolerate things that we agree with, which we don't think are too repulsive and damaging. So I think people will kind of put up with the fact that, there may be other religious views but we kind of tolerate them as long as they're kept private and they don't impact some of what we see as our core values of individual identity and autonomy and self-determination, and a sort of warped view of equality. So if those values are threatened by someone else's views, then we don't tolerate them. So it's a little bit broader, not much broader, but a little bit broader than just things we don't agree with.
That's fair.
We have another one.
Yeah, let's have another one. Okay. How about this one then? If God made everything, then who made God?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know what? I get asked that question more than you think.
Do you? It's a weird question, I think, but go on.
It's also,
why is it weird, Josh?
Because it assumes that God's a created thing, which would be completely misunderstand what the point of God is.
Well, you've answered the question already.
Well, I have in a way, haven't I? Next one.
Quick fire! Look at that. Yeah. See, all we have to do is let Josh answer. It's quick fire.
I think it's the sort of question, particularly youth and children ask. I think more sometimes, adults will ask it sometimes, but generally they'll ask a slightly more sophisticated question about, if they know anything about Adam and Eve or something, they ask, something like that. But yeah. Do you want to answer it yourself, Josh? Because you kind of half answered it already.
Well, okay. Well, I guess my only thought is the atheist has the same problem, don't they? Ultimately, everybody needs a first cause at some point.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to accept some kind of infinite regression of cause and effect, which is kind of illogical once you start looking at that and what that means. So there's a first cause problem for everyone. So you could turn that question around immediately and say, well, if you think the universe exists, which presumably you do, then who created the universe? And if you say the universe created the universe, then that's just a circular argument. It doesn't make sense. So the theist who says that God created the universe is positing, I suppose, a first cause, an uncaused cause, and I suppose going along with that, which we've talked about in a previous episode, are all the characteristics that that kind of cause might need. What kind of cause would be sufficient and efficient to create the effect, which is the universe? And we start describing that cause, and that description is what we call God. And so ultimately you do have to at some point have a prime mover, a first cause. You're either going to have to say the universe just is, it's a brute fact, or the universe is infinite in the past, or something else uncaused caused it. So everybody has the same problem, really. It's not a great question for the atheist to ask, I don't think.
No, and if they got a few minutes talking about infinity and all those things is good. I think sometimes just saying, by definition, God is not created, otherwise he wouldn't be God. That sometimes works. Sometimes you can say something flashy like it's a category error, because in the category God, you're not created. But you can just say God is not created because by definition God is not created. What would you say, Mark?
I'm not sure I could add anything else on top of any of those answers.
All right.
Stamp of approval.
That's good.
All right. Well, should we have? I reckon we got time for one more. We've got like 4 or 5 minutes, so let's have one more, and we can spend a few minutes on it. This one, I suppose, you'd need somebody who has a little bit more biblical knowledge, maybe, but might ask a question like, "Why did God allow Adam and Eve to fall, to sin in the first place?"
Yeah, Mark can go for this one, but just to say, I've been asked that a lot in lots of different contexts, even for people who haven't got great biblical knowledge. But as soon as you sort of unfold the story, whether it's specifically about Adam and Eve or whether it's just about letting evil in, it's not the same as the suffering question, which is sort of behind it, but it can be just as simple as kind of why did God let that happen thing. So I think it's a pretty common question. I'm quite excited about the question, and I'm excited about Mark's answer.
Well, there we go. I think with this one, like with lots of them, but I think with this one more so, you just have to answer with a great measure of humility.
Yes.
Because I'm not sure the Bible gives us the definitive answer on this. So we are kind of we're working through what we know of who God is, how he seems to work, how he seems to operate from all our understanding. So we're not able to go with, hey, yeah, here's a definite answer and here's a verse.
Yeah.
But there are lots in there that would suggest, isn't it, that so I think we want to affirm, well, God did allow. It's not that it was outside of his control, that he is in control of that. He allowed it. It seems that ultimately the top answer, as it were, is for his glory, that through somehow allowing this to happen, bringing about Christ and salvation of mankind, brings him the greatest amount of glory, honour. Someone will then go, well, isn't that a little bit, whatever, narcissistic? And well, not if glory is the highest value in the whole of the universe, then it's right that God upholds that. So, so you're kind of in those kind of fields. I think there is probably also, you're then kind of moving into the kind of, well, it seems to be the way in which, how do you, Adam and Eve are in a garden, they've got a role as in terms of priestly. They're seeking to relate with the Lord. There seems to be clear boundaries. This is right. This is wrong. They know what is right. They're not wrong. And there's a testing that happens for royal children, and they failed the test. And there is that ongoing sense that actually the ways in which then God refines, matures his people. Is through that sense of testing and trial. Until you get to the Lord Jesus, who goes through a test and a trial, and he doesn't mess up and sin. So I think there's lots of ways you can go with that, but you do so with a humility.
I'm not sure I could add anything to that, Mark. That was so comprehensive. I think sometimes you use the tapestry argument, but this is not adding to it, rather illustrative argument to say, like if anyone knows about tapestry, but from the underneath you've got loads of bare threads hanging all over the place. From the top you can see this beautiful pattern. I think the whole of human history and even before creation, if you know what I mean by that, is all visible to God, and he has a plan. We're just looking from the underneath and we can't see the plan, and that would be true of many questions. It's not, I don't want to cop out and say so we've got no hope, but I think it is sometimes worth saying we just don't have the perspective of God on that, but in the end,
is why,
you finish.
Well, no, which is why I think you then end up going with themes, don't you, throughout the Bible? So you're seeing themes that seem to be that then connect, even though I can't have that full understanding. There is a humility there, isn't there? So there seems to be a theme of testing that seems to flow throughout Scripture. There seems to be a theme of, Satan turning up at key times, wanting, to see how people respond. You see that in Job. You see that with Jesus. So there seems to be something there that the Lord allows, that he thinks is good for his children, his people.
Well, and the fact of the devil turning up, it shows is that there's a cosmic, if that's the right word, drama playing out with whatever happened with God creating all creatures, including the devil falling, the declaration to all spiritual beings of God's love and character in salvation, in sin and salvation. So how that drama plays out, what that all means, we don't see it. We certainly don't see it from the devil's perspective and his understanding. We definitely don't see it from God's perspective. So there's that whole drama, that whole cosmic thing going on, which is worth kind of plugging people into.
It's great, because as soon as you start talking like this, your mind starts to whirl, doesn't it? You start thinking, well, yeah, of course there's a cosmic drama, and then you're thinking, well, yeah, remember in Job how Satan seems to be allowed into the very throne room of God. I mean, that just seems what? This agent of evil is allowed into the throne room of God, who asks permission, God allows. All of that's playing out. So you're kind of, there's lots of these. When we're seeking to answer the Bible, the Bible gives us threads and things for us to think upon and chew upon. But at the end of the day, we don't have all the answers.
No, and it is a really good question to start with. I don't know precisely, because I think it's fair enough when someone asks a question like that, say I don't know exactly, and then go on to say, oh, there's other things. So you can say here are just like Mark did, but I think it's really important on that question. Why did Jesus die on the cross? You don't say, well, I'm not sure, but I think it might be this. You say this. Did God create Adam and Eve? Was there a real historical King David? There's no hesitation. Why did God allow Adam to sin? There's a hesitation that you have to start with. But yeah, it will be fun. I think we should do this again in a month's time or 2 months' time or something, with a few more.
Definitely. Yeah, and if you as listeners have had people ask you questions that you'd like me to throw at these two, then please email them and I will be happy to do that. ordinary@cch.org.uk.